Right. Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Brown. I'm giving a talk here called Disclosure and Christianity Assessing the Potential for Theological Disruption. Before I start, I want to just give a little bit of kind of personal note here. What I intend to do today is present some material that is fairly critical of the view that most people consider to be Christianity. And I want to note that I'm doing that from a personal position of love and care, not because I dislike the tradition. This is my original spiritual home. I still consider myself a Christian in some sense, but as we'll see here today, I am puzzled by some of the details. Let me just go ahead and jump right in here. Disclosure is this kind of hopeful moment when enough information comes out about whatever is going on with UFOs and related phenomenon that people kind of en masse go through an experience that's sometimes called ontological shock, where they're trying to wrap their minds around the implications of what this means. And for many of us, disclosure is concerning. There's a speaker, Alex Wendt, he's here at Ohio State, who gave a talk, a professor, he gave a talk at the Soul Foundation recently, and talking about some of the political implications of UFO disclosure. And he spoke toward the end of that of a certain wisdom involved in the UFO taboo. Sometimes people wonder if UFOs exist and the US government knows about them. How could this have been hidden for so long? And I have come to believe that that in order for it to have remained hidden for as long as it has, or to the degree that it has for as long as it has, that there must be some good reason for why the people who know about it feel like they can't just openly share it. And it's this kind of wisdom of keeping it a secret for some amount of time and being careful about how that information gets out, that I want to kind of address here at the beginning. Because the idea is that as we know more about what's going on, there could be fairly significant disruptions in government. This is what Alex Wendt is concerned about, disruptions of global power. Is, of course, concerns about economic impact. My friend Helen has written a helpful paper on this and is trying to call attention to the kind of business and financial world about what this might mean and how we could respond to it. Neither of those are my particular area of interest. My particular area of interest and expertise is in religion. So what I want to do here is say I suspect that religious impacts will not be evenly distributed. Some traditions like Hinduism, Buddhism, and most indigenous religions already believe something kind of similar to what seems to be on the horizon with disclosure. That is, they believe that there are some kinds of beings who have been engaging with humans for long periods of time, have taught us things, supervised us in various ways, interacted with us in various ways. So I actually expect that the religious impacts on traditions like this will be relatively minimal. Sometimes people suggest that it will be most disruptive for the Neil deGrasse Tyson types of the world, these kind of debunkers and materialists. And I do suspect that people of that ilk, they really might have to accept some novel new beliefs. The world of the UFOs and the paranormal seem to be giving us some suggestions that our materialist worldview might be mistaken, that we might need to accept the existence of things like telepathy, and of course, exotic beings and exotic objects. However, I don't expect this to go particularly poorly because in many ways it's moving from a more sparse worldview to a more fun worldview, the kind of science fiction worldview that many of us kind of wish were true. And there might be a sense of relief or even a sense of excitement among that community. It's Christianity that I'm most worried about because Christianity might need to revise some of its most entrenched dogmas. And I use dogma in its technical sense here. These are doctrines that have been determined by whoever the relevant authorities of the community are to be mandatory for being a believer in good standing. So this is my big claim that I'm going to be trying to unpack today, that I believe Christianity is uniquely vulnerable to disruption. Now, as a good philosopher, I need to define my terms, and what Christianity is not at all straightforward. This is a 2,000-year-old movement that spans the globe and has engaged in all kinds of different theologies and different kinds of sets of practices. And so I'm not going to be able, of course, to try to map out all of that. That would be ridiculous. But there are kind of four ways that I want to define Christianity so that I can refer to some differences between them as I go through. The first I'm going to call synoptic Christianity. So this is just the events described in the most historically well-founded gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to take those as an assumption for the rest of the talk. I'm just going to assume that everything described in Matthew, Mark, and Luke did actually happen as described. So Jesus was born of a virgin, engaged in a lot of miraculous activity, was crucified, and rose from the dead. All that kind of stuff, I'm just going to assume when I'm speaking of Christianity, that's the kind of core synoptic Christianity. If I try to imagine what is the sparsest possible historically respected Christianity, I think this is it. After the events of the Synoptic Gospels, there was a period that I'm calling Apostolic Christianity. This is the wide variety of theological explorations that emerged over the first 3 centuries of the Christian church. I will not be talking much about this, but I do just want to note in passing that there were many views of who Jesus was and who God is and how Jesus relates to God and what kinds of things happened and which texts should be considered authoritative. And there was a really broad variety of beliefs during this roughly 3-century long apostolic period. And then the main target of my discussion today is this range of beliefs that I'm calling imperial Christianity. So this is the theological structure established in the first 7 ecumenical councils that were convened and enforced originally by Constantine and then by succeeding emperors. So this is Nicaea and Constantinople and no, Chalcedon. And anyways, I shouldn't have done that. The kind of Nicene Chalcedonian synthesis, that kind of stuff. And then there is a period that I'll call divided Christianity. I'm really not going to talk about this at all, but after the Great Schism between the East and the West, there were many varieties of Christianity that developed. And the only reason I even mention this is because imperial Christianity is not intended to be used as a kind of temporally bound way of thinking about this, because the way that Christianity developed after the 7 ecumenical councils essentially assumes the dogmatic foundations of imperial Christianity almost universally. There are some groups that have challenged various components of the basic synthesis that I'm going to be talking about here today. But for the most part, when people call themselves Christians in the modern world, I take it that they believe something along the lines of what I'm calling imperial Christianity. So I want to just give a very quick crash course in how imperial Christianity works. This is very, very technical stuff, and I am not an expert in it. I've been spending some time talking to Christian theologians about this, trying to get clear about what seems relevant to the issues I'm concerned with and what aren't. So I hope I haven't made any egregious errors in what I'm about to do, but I believe that what I'm about to do is accurate to this perspective. So there is a being, God with a big G. We'll define some terms here a little bit later. And this being has a nature, the divine nature. It is in 3 parts, traditionally referred to as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Because this is a personal notion of God, the divine nature contains mind and will and energies. In a nutshell, mind would be the set of all of the beliefs that are true, containing, of course, no beliefs that are false. Will is something analogous to the set of values and choices that are made, perfect values and choices in this case, and energies are the kinds of powers and things that can be done by this being. They are somehow connected, although as far as I understand it, this is one of the matters of theological dispute about exactly how the mind, will, and energies are related between the three persons of the Trinity. Not something that I'm going to address here. I do want to address in passing that if you kind of look at these three core features, I think they correlate with the standard triple definition of God within the Abrahamic traditions. Perfect mind would be omniscience, perfect will would be omnibenevolence, and perfect energies would be omnipotence. So that's God, the triune God, as defined by councils like Nicaea, and clarified in a couple of other ways after that. And then, of course, there's this question of who Jesus of Nazareth is. And he is divine and human, fully divine and fully human. And the way this gets articulated is that Jesus of Nazareth has both, well, Jesus of Nazareth, I'll just use to refer to the human nature, is connected to the second person of the divine nature, the divine Trinity. There's a connection between Jesus and the divine Son. Jesus has his own distinct mind, will, and energies. So Jesus's mind, Jesus of Nazareth's mind, does not contain all of omniscience. So he can learn things, he could forget things, there's things that he doesn't know. His will then be related to his mind, so he doesn't act based on the full access to omniscient knowledge, and his energies are whatever the human energies are. But then there is this relation between the divine nature and the human nature, called the hypostatic union, which in a nutshell ensures in a mysterious way that all of these things are aligned with each other. So the person of Jesus of Nazareth will never act against anything that's going on in the divine nature, and in fact is always acting perfectly in sync with it. Okay. So that's the view that I want to express concern about today. And I want to begin by considering a hypothetical disclosure that I take to be undermining to belief in imperial Christianity. When I say undermining, I do not mean contradictory to. So I don't mean that it would be somehow logically impossible to reconcile the scenario that I'm going to imagine here with the doctrines that I've just tried to articulate. I'm going to suggest that if this kind of disclosure happened, it would undermine belief in imperial Christianity in the following sense. Whatever reasons one might have for coming to believe that imperial Christianity is true, they would be substantially weakened, such that perhaps it would no longer be rational for as many people to believe in imperial Christianity. That's the claim. It's an epistemic undermining claim. It's not a strict contradiction claim. So here's the kind of scenario that I suspect might happen. And even if it doesn't happen, this is the kind of scenario that I'm concerned by. So let's say that contact is made with an exceedingly ancient, multi-species, multi-planetary consortium of non-human beings. This consortium seems to be functioning at least as well as any large-scale community of imperial Christians with comparable moral depth. Due to their long history of development and mutual understanding, perhaps facilitated by telepathy, they share the same general worldview. This worldview confirms and explains the key events of synoptic Christianity and the key events of all other known spiritual traditions. However, this world undermines at least one key dogma of imperial Christianity. So were this to occur, I take it that this would provide fairly strong evidence against the truth of imperial Christianity, that it would essentially suggest that the imperial Christian movement had moved too far past the data gained through the events described in the synoptic gospels, and that there is essentially a failure in theorizing, so that the data set of imperial Christianity is correct, or the core data set is correct. Jesus was born of a virgin. carried out miracles, gave really profound spiritual teaching, was crucified and rose from the dead. All of those things are true, but then there was some error that theologians made somewhere along the way in the construction of the dogmatic formulas internal to imperial Christianity. Now, this is not, in my view, only hypothetical, in part because I suspect that we actually do have some reasons to believe that such a disclosure might actually occur in the not too distant future. But I'm mostly going to be pushing this point by referring not to the distant future, but the ancient past, because non-Christian religions already pose similar problems for imperial Christianity. So what I'm trying to do here ultimately is an exercise in cross-cultural philosophy of religion, minimally among the religious traditions here on Earth and perhaps among the religious traditions elsewhere. I am going to do this by talking about Puranic Hinduism. So this is the Hinduism of the Puranas, so kind of later than the mere Vedas. I am not an expert in Hinduism. I know my way around the basics. I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. I do want to note that everything I say here is about Hinduism, but not unique to Hinduism. I could make similar arguments with regard to Taoism in China, for instance. I could make similar arguments with regard to Buddhism. But I think that the points I'm trying to make will be easiest to see in talking about Hinduism. But the claims I'm making are not restricted to Hinduism. When I teach Asian philosophies, which I do every semester and have for about 10 years, I do an exercise at the beginning of class where I talk about the distinction between monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, and atheism. That is one God, many gods, everything is God, and nothing is God. And I have students tell me, what do you suspect a polytheistic religion is? And almost every time someone says Hinduism, and almost every time someone says Hinduism first. This is not correct. Hinduism is not a polytheistic tradition. The reason that people think it is a polytheistic tradition is because of the devas. So there are a lot of divine beings in some sense. Now, one of the problems with doing theology in the West is that our terminology that we use tends to blur the distinction between two different kinds of beings. That is, the big ultimate ground of all being and any being substantially more powerful than humans have the same word assigned to it. So in English, we use the word God for both types of beings. And you have to write it with a lowercase g if you're talking about beings like Thor and Odin, and you have to write it with an uppercase G if you're talking about the source of all reality. One of the nice things about Sanskrit is there are more terms to use. So the devas are something like minor deities, more like you would expect Thor or Odin or Zeus to be. And in early Hinduism, Vedic Hinduism in particular, there were a lot of them, and there are rather a lot of stories told about them in the Vedas and also in the Puranas. I want to focus on Shaivism just because it's going to be easier to use one example than to go through many, although I'll refer back to some of the other ones. Shaivism is the kind of school of theology and practice associated specifically with this being Shiva. So Shiva has a female counterpart, wife character, Parvati. They have a child, Ganesh. There's a very famous story about how Ganesh came into being. Essentially, Shiva was traveling, Parvati was bathing, and in order to protect her privacy, Parvati creates Ganesh. Ganesh originally looked like a normal human boy. When Shiva gets home, he tries to come in the house. Ganesh says you can't go in there because he doesn't recognize who Shiva is. Shiva gets angry and cuts off Ganesh's head. Parvati then scolds Shiva, and Shiva has one of his folk go and remove the head of an elephant and replaces Ganesh's head with an elephant. This is how Ganesh came into being. This, I take it, is indicative of the kind of tales that we see about these devas, minor deities, etc. There's not an assumption of absolute knowledge. Shiva doesn't know who Ganesh is. There's not an assumption of moral perfection. Shiva seems to lose his temper. There seems to be various limitations on power. So in the kind of standard mythology of Hinduism and essentially all other traditions of which I'm aware, this class of beings are more powerful, more knowledgeable than we are, but they are not perfect in any way. So, if we were writing this in English, I would write these with small g's. Is there a big G god in Hinduism? Definitely. That being, it's called Brahman. The symbol that I'm using here is the Aum symbol, right? And there's all kinds of fascinating theology and practice having to do with the sound and the symbol of Aum, but I'll just use this to represent Brahman. I'm going to quickly read a selection from one of the Upanishads. What is the cause of the cosmos? Is it Brahman? From where do we come? By what live? Where shall we find peace at last? What power governs the duality of pleasure and pain by which we are driven? Time, nature, necessity, accident, elements, energy, intelligence. None of these can be the first cause. They are effects whose only purpose is to help the self rise above pleasure and pain. In the depths of meditation, sages saw within themselves the Lord of love, who dwells in the heart of every creature. Deep in the hearts of all he dwells, hidden behind the gunas of law, energy, and inertia. He is one. He it is who rules over time, space, and causality. I take it that this is Big G God. First cause, Lord of love, undergirds everything, is the source of all, is the one who rules over time, space, and causality. This is not a little G God. This is Big G God. So we have at least two beings that are distinct in some sense, Brahman and Shiva. But as Shaivism develops over time, Shiva and Brahman become equated, or at least near equated. So Shiva starts to be referred to using all the same kinds of language that people use to refer to Brahman. So Shiva starts to be spoken of as all-knowing and perfectly good and all-powerful. Shiva essentially becomes treated as omni-god. Now, in other parts of Hinduism, a different being, Vishnu, is also treated in this way. So over time, the Vaishnavite tradition starts to speak of him as Big G God, and Shiva among the Shaivites also as Big G God. And you might wonder how exactly this fleshes out, because now you have an identity between Shiva and Brahman and Vishnu and Brahman. So now what is the relationship between Vishnu and Shiva? What ends up happening is there's another character, Brahma, who comes in at the same kind of level, and they are assigned certain roles in reality, or they become associated with certain roles. So Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the sustainer, and Shiva is the destroyer. I do want to note right away that Shiva is in no way a villain. So when we think about a destroyer, Shiva is often spoken of as the destroyer primarily of evil, or perhaps also a transformer. He is the one who brings to an end so that something can begin anew. There are Christian analogs of this in the kind of apostolic Christian era, views that later came to be viewed as heretical, where God relates to the world through three different modes. In some, there might be some difference between God engaging as Father, God engaging as Son, or God engaging as Holy Spirit. This view, as I said, came to be viewed as heretical, but this is essentially how Hinduism fleshes out this doctrine, which is called the doctrine of the Trimurti. So Brahman acting as creator is Brahma, Brahman acting as Vishnu is sustainer, and Brahma acting as destroyer is Shiva. All right. How does this relate to the background metaphysics of Hinduism? I want to just go through a little framework that I have developed so that it's easier to articulate what all of the various options between the relations between the cosmos, that is, whatever realm that we live in, extended out, etc., like whatever things there are that God has made or the existence of which God is responsible for somehow, and God, the divine itself. So this is just my attempt to explore all possible set theoretic relationships between the set of the things that are the cosmos and the set of the things that are divine. I've given all these things terms with little Greek prefixes. Nullism would be the belief that there is neither a cosmos nor God. This would be the belief that there is literally nothing. Atheism, there is no God. Microtheism is that the divine is somehow a subset of the cosmos. Autotheism would be God alone. There is no cosmos at all. Pantheism is an exact equivalence of between the cosmos and the divine. Panentheism, the cosmos is a subset of the divine. Hemitheism, the divine and the cosmos partially overlap, and apotheism, the divine and the cosmos are distinct. I do want to note, as I noted a minute ago, that microtheism is not the same concept at all as these larger notions of God. So if the divine were somehow a subset of the cosmos, that would be a different kind of being. Now, it's possible that devas or Thor or aliens could be beings of this kind. So I'm just going to represent that using a different color. I'm just going to use blue to represent beings of that kind. But of course, that also means that those could exist in the other traditions as well, or in the other scenarios as well. I'm, for the purposes of today, going to ignore everything on the top here. I'm just going to talk about these four options, which are really in scope if we're talking about traditions like Hinduism and Christianity. So I'm going to call the blanket term that covers all four of these macrotheism, right? The macro God, the macrotheistic entity is the one, the big one, big G God, the thing that explains everything somehow. I'm going to distinguish between endotheistic views, where the cosmos is fully internal, either because of full identity or because it's a proper subset of the divine, and exotheism, where hemitheism is the idea that at least some of the cosmos is internal to the divine somehow, whereas apotheism is that the cosmos is fully distinct. Internal to Hinduism, all of these traditions exist except possibly hemitheism, but the other three definitely do. So this view is called Dvaita Vedanta. Vedanta just means the completion of the Vedas, so it's just the name of the tradition that takes the Vedas seriously in a particular way. The Dvaita means other, separate. So the cosmos and the divine are distinct. Advaita Vedanta is actually philosophically the dominant tradition, as far as I understand it, in Hinduism, that there is no distinction between the cosmos and the divine, that they are identical in some way. And there is this view, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, which is panentheistic. This is qualified, non-dual Vedanta. So the cosmos is an aspect of the divine, but it is not the entirety. So there are aspects of the divine that transcend the cosmos. Incidentally, there are panentheistic versions of other traditions. There seems to be in Ibn al-Arabi panentheistic versions of Sufi Islam. Various Christian theologians have at least talked about panentheism. It's not obvious to me that there is any tradition which is hemitheistic. If I had to guess, I wonder if Berkeley's idealism might count as hemitheistic, because he seems to believe that minds are distinct from the divine mind, but that we have a common perception of the material world. I don't know. I don't care about this too much. I just had to have it there for theoretical completion. Okay, so here in a nutshell is the big picture of how Hinduism works now, at least after this Puranic period, after the Vedas, after the Trimurti become the dominant beings who are discussed. There are a bunch of Vedas, but three of them are special. The Trimurti have some uniquely a substantial relationship to Brahman. They are the most divine of the things which are internal to the divine. So Hinduism, for the most part, is endotheistic. That is, everything that exists is divine in some sense, but Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are divine in a very special sense. There are also a bunch of humans. Most of us are normal, but a few of us are not. I'm going to pick Krishna as our kind of most important case in Hinduism of a divinely infused or a divinely present human. Krishna is an avatar. I'll talk about avatars here in just a moment. Krishna has a wife, Radha. She is also divine in some sense that's different from ordinary people like me and you, but not in the same way that Krishna is. And as Hinduism develops, it includes various teachings about Jesus. So Jesus is also presumed to be divine in a sense that is different from those of us who are mere folk, but also different from the way that Krishna is divine. At least this is how it is interpreted internal to Hinduism. I want to quickly lay out 6 options. My Sanskrit is terrible, so I'm not going to try to pronounce all of these. I'll just refer to them conceptually. So there are avatara. These are the avatars. They are descents of a deva. So one of these beings, these micro deities, like Vishnu or Ganesh or Parvati, they come into a human somehow. There's at least 3 different ways that this works. You can have a full incarnation, you can have a partial incarnation, or you can have a power imbued incarnation. So a full incarnation is relatively close. It's not the same, but it is quite similar to what imperial Christianity says about Jesus of Nazareth. It is not the same. The hypostatic union is different from this idea, but it is similar in important ways. The distinction between full and partial is how much of the divine property set is present in the life of the avatar. So a full incarnation is present in all of the ways that, say, Vishnu could be in a human form. They're often born and they die. They live complete lives, but they are fully incarnated versions of one of the devas. So Krishna is a full incarnation, a full avatar of Vishnu. Not the only one, by the way. There's also Ram and others who are full incarnations of Vishnu. So Vishnu has become fully incarnate at least twice. Partial incarnations, these are humans who have not incomplete presence of all of the divine attributes of the deva that is incarnate, or the deva that has descended into this body. And then a power imbued incarnation is something like a temporary incarnation. So a person has some kind of distinct identity, but they are embodied temporarily by one of the devas and granted some of the devas' powers. And then there are the Anavatara. These are just the non-avatars. This is the rest of us. So these are not devas coming to Earth as a human in any way. They're just other beings. There are those of us who are liberated while alive. So whoever we are who manage to overcome our karma and attain enlightenment while alive, that's these folk. There are various people who are just great spiritual leaders, but not fully liberated, not fully enlightened yet. And then there's ordinary people like you and me who are spiritual aspirants or practitioners in general. Okay. So you can see how Hinduism has developed this very elaborate, multifaceted way of talking about a whole lot of different possible interpretations of what kind of being Brahman is, the ways in which Brahman engages with the world, both in the realm of the devas and in the realm of the humans. There are lots of beings around, and there are lots of options about how to discuss them. So, what I want to do now is a little bit of cross-cultural philosophy of religion using this framework. And I need one more tool before I can kind of wrap up the main things that I want to say here. I need to introduce you to the causal theory of reference. So, in the philosophy of language, we have words, which are language specific, and concepts, which are language independent. So, the word agua and the word water refer to the same substance, H2O. And why is that? How does that work exactly? How do our concepts refer to objects? So the kind of standard way that this works out is called the causal theory of reference, and the way it works is that there is an object. So in this case, we'll talk about the big bright thing, the big bright hot thing in the sky. That object is real, and it causes us to have perceptions of it. In a modern scientific way, it emits photons. They get absorbed into our eyes and passed into our brains, and however that relates to our mind, right? There is an object and it causes us to have a concept. We then name that concept, and this is how we can actually speak to each other across linguistic boundaries. So one of us can point at that thing and say, sun, and then another one could point at that thing and say, soul, or whatever the word is in the other language. And by that, we come to understand how the person who speaks a different language is referring to the same object, literally by pointing. So, what's interesting for our purposes is that it does not actually require any accurate understanding about what that object is. So, let's say that in this case, the English speaker believes that it is a giant ball of fire, which we now know is an oxidation reaction, and the sun is not an oxidation reaction. So, this person's view is false. This other person, our Spanish speaker, believes that it is a nuclear fusion reaction, which is at least closer to the truth, or at least a part of a more complete truth. So, in order for a concept to refer, it does not have to be correct. In fact, none of the views have to be correct in order to refer to the object. As long as there is an object and the object is causing the concepts in the right kind of way, then the concepts refer to the object. This is important for my purposes because there are a series of arguments that are given for a being, a divine being, the being that I will call macro God, that all share a certain set of features. They're singularizing in the sense that if they are successful, they can only have one referent. They can only refer to one thing. So what makes them singularizing, a singularizing argument is an argument for macro God based on an absolute superlative. So it's this kind of without restrictions reference to some superlative good-making property. There's at least two types of arguments that do this. Ontological arguments, most famously that by Anselm. God is defined by Anselm as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. In Hinduism, there's also versions of ontological arguments where you get something like this: Brahman alone is the absolutely real, infinite, and self-luminous principle. If these arguments work, they are referring to one specific thing. There can't be more than one that than which nothing greater can be conceived. There cannot be more than one thing which is alone absolutely real, infinite, and self-luminous. Similarly, this is true of cosmological arguments. So Plato, for instance, talks about the self-moved principle, which must be the first and greatest origin of motion in all things. And in Hinduism, we also have very parallel arguments. There must be a singular, self-existent, and eternal cause. Ishvara, which is another word in the realm of Brahman, like Brahman as Lord or Brahman as personal to be loved, who is the ultimate source of all. So sometimes people try to suggest that the beings of the various macro-theistic traditions might be different beings. And I'm going to suggest that they cannot be different beings. So all successful singularizing arguments for macro God refer to the same being regardless of their conceptual variations. So whatever else anybody might believe about it, if there's a successful singularizing argument for a being, there's only one of those beings. So in the same way that different words across languages refer to the same being, even if the concepts are distinct and incompatible, even if all of the concepts are wrong, they are still referring to the same object. So I take it that concepts like El Elyon, this is God Most High, Theos, as used by philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, Allah, as used in Islam, and Brahman, as used in Hinduism. These necessarily refer to the same being if they refer to anything. There can only be one macro God. So what I want to do now is get back to my concerns for imperial Christianity. And I want to suggest that there are two dogmas about imperial Christianity that seem to me relatively unstable. They are unstable because of the precision with which they have been defined, which allows them not to be particularly flexible. So the first one is Trinitarian Jewish monotheism. So there is one God who uniquely chose the Jewish people and miraculously intervened among them, as described in the Old Testament. That being has always been one and three, as modeled in the ecumenical creeds. My concern about this is that it equates the tribal deity of the Jewish people with macro God while attempting to deny parallel moves in traditions like Hinduism. If you look back into the history of Judaism, it seems quite clear that the God of the Jewish people was originally seen as one among many. There's even evidence that in its earliest forms, he had a female counterpart. And over time, it seems likely that what happened is this being moved, developed from being the singular guardian of this one tribe, this one group of people, to being something like the ruler of all, the most significant of all, to eventually being the only one. We've seen a parallel thing happen with Shiva in Shaivite Hinduism. We've also seen a parallel thing happen with Vishnu. The same basic idea has happened. There is a character in the tribal lore, the tribal mythology, and he, over time, as the kind of singularizing arguments of philosophy operate, comes to be equated with this one being in ways that eventually cause theological problems that have to be solved in some way. And Hinduism solves them in one way, and Trinitarian Jewish monotheism, the Trinitarian theism of Christianity, solves it in a different way. It's not clear to me how we could possibly have the information required to discriminate between these two ways of reconciling our mythologies with the kind of singularizing arguments that lead to macro God. So it seems to me problematic, fragile to suggest that this one way of articulating the relationship between the cosmos and the divine beings that we encounter in the supernatural space and macro God, how that's going to work out. Similarly with Christology, exclusivist Christology. So Jesus of Nazareth is the sole human incarnation of the second person of the divine Trinity. His life, death, and resurrection uniquely constitute the complete revelation of God to the world. Through him alone, we are saved from our sins and reconciled to God in a way that implies the incompleteness or falsehood of other religions. In a way that you can probably predict by now, I'm concerned that this equates the mysteriously born, miracle working teacher of the Synoptic Gospels with the Jewish macro God, while attempting to deny parallel moves in traditions like Hinduism. There appears to be a one-for-one analog between the stories told about Krishna and the stories told about Jesus. That is, Krishna was born of a virgin, was able to walk on water, was able to heal the sick and raise the dead. That he essentially exhibits all of the same kinds of divine attributes that we see in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But he, of course, is not equated in Hinduism to the god of Israel. He is instead equated to Vishnu. Again, I'm concerned that there isn't going to be a plausible way to suggest that Christianity is in a position to equate Jesus with the divine in a way that Hinduism is not able to equate Krishna with the divine, regardless of the differences between how the theory works out, especially because the details of the theoretical constraints on each one seem to be so specifically culture bound. So, if this is true, how is it that Christianity has up until now excluded Hinduism? In all honesty, the most straightforward answer is that it's simply ignoring it. Precious few Christians are even slightly aware of what Hinduism actually teaches. Almost everybody who considers themselves a Christian believes that Hinduism is, for instance, a polytheistic tradition. It is not a polytheistic tradition. It is very much a monotheistic tradition. It has all the same kinds of singularizing arguments as the Abrahamic traditions do. There is an almost exact one-for-one analog between cosmological arguments in the Abrahamic traditions and cosmological arguments in Hinduism. Ontological arguments and ontological arguments, design arguments, moral arguments, religious experience arguments. They're all there in both traditions. It's just that most people in Christianity have no idea that it's there. It's also, of course, been dismissed by demonizing it. And when I mean demonizing it, I mean literally demonizing it, like making the claim that Vishnu and Shiva and Parvati and Ganesh are actually demons. So, in the kind of Christian theology, that they are spiritual beings who are evil, that they have rebelled against God, and that therefore they are to be greatly feared and ignored. This is wildly implausible, given the commonality of singularizing arguments, the high moral quality of the best parts of Hinduism, and the low moral quality of the worst parts of Christianity. The idea that Christianity is holy and Hinduism is evil is preposterous. Anybody who thinks this does not know what they're talking about. It is not possible to reduce the full tradition of Hinduism and all of its complexity to simply saying it is the work of the devil. This is ignorance of the highest form, and furthermore implausible because Hinduism and Christianity are at least on a par with regard to their general moral quality. Like, it's pretty easy for anybody in a Christian tradition to point at the worst parts of the Hindu tradition and say, look at all those bad things that happen. We can save you from that. But Hindus can, of course, do exactly the same thing in response to Christianity. They can pick the worst parts of Christianity and say, you can safely ignore them because we can save you from that. This is not actually what Hinduism does, but in principle it could. So the exclusion one way would just as well justify the exclusion the other way. And it shouldn't be excluded anyways because the singularizing arguments are essentially identical. These are two traditions that believe in the same kind of being. They just theorize about it in different ways. Another option, which is the way that I did it up until relatively recently, is by mythologizing it. So C.S. Lewis very famously said this. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth, where the others are men's myths. Lewis was actually quite aware of Hinduism and quite well read. And this was his personal solution to the problem. How does Lewis, in reading the Bhagavad Gita, when seeing the stories of Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu, essentially a triune, incarnate, personal God, asking for personal devotion, how does he reconcile this with his Christianity? He assumes that the Bhagavad Gita is a mere myth and a predecessor to the preaching of the gospel, that God has implanted in the imagination of the Hindu people a version of the gospel so that when Thomas and the other early Christians arrive in India, they will be able to convert to Christianity. This is Lewis's view. I've been talking all about Christianity and Hinduism. What's up with the UFOs and the aliens and the NHI and the disclosure? Why do I think this might be relevant? Why do I think we are moving from a scenario where not only have we been mostly just ignoring or demonizing Hinduism, but why might there be something new that makes us reconsider the role of and the plausibility of imperial Christianity? So my suggestion is that disclosure, UFO disclosure of the kind I imagined earlier, NHI disclosure, alien disclosure, undermines exclusion through mythologizing in the way that Lewis suggests. Obviously, ignoring a tradition is not a sufficient response. Demonizing a tradition inappropriately is not a sufficient response. What do we make of this mythologizing kind of claim that Lewis tries to use? So Christianity, Hinduism, and UFO lore all contain virgin births, miraculous healings, levitation, passing through solid objects, and profound spiritual teachings. It's plausible that all of these are going to stand and fall together. That is, if it turns out that modern UFO experiencers are becoming pregnant without having sex, which they seem to be, that we see people being healed from diseases miraculously, which they seem to be, et cetera, that there's more plausibly a common explanation to all of them. If you accept Christianity and UFOs, you're going to have to also accept Hinduism. And in general, you're going to have to accept that a lot of these things, which have been allegedly mythologized away, are likely to turn out to be true. So that the number of contacts with beings who have the sort of supernatural capacities that Jesus of Nazareth had might turn out to be quite numerous. This is not surprising if you've spent any time with the Indic traditions, because Hinduism and Jainism and Buddhism, they all believe that beings like Jesus, in the sense described in the Synoptic Gospels, have occurred in human history many times, and that Jesus's powers and his insight and all of that are a result of his being an especially spiritually advanced person. Another way in which disclosure might be relevant is that it undermines the equation of any one microdeity with macro God. If we become aware of the involvement of very powerful non-human beings in our past, it becomes much less plausible that any one culture was correct in exclusively equating their tribal deity with macro God. If we come to believe that there is a fairly substantial community of beings that is engaging with humanity, that has powers of the kinds that the Devas have, then it's unlikely that any one of those beings was simply macro God in a way that is exclusive of the others. This is especially true if the tribal microdeity engaged in morally questionable activities. So, for instance, in the story of Shiva, we see this impatient beheading of a child. This should lead us to question whether Shiva is properly fully equated with Brahman, or whether he is something else. In the case of the God of Israel, the commands to commit genocide are comparable. It's more plausible that tribal microdeities were always finite and imperfect non-human beings of some kind or another. This is fully compatible with the success of all singularizing arguments for macro God. So this does in no way undermine the idea that macro God, the big G God, the ground of all being, the being that is responsible for the existence of all things, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, the first cause, etc. This does nothing to undermine that. What it does is to undermine the specific characters as described in the mythological tribal era stories of the beings that are directly engaging us, like Shiva and Vishnu. It's the claim that those can be straightforwardly equated with macro God looks like it gets undermined, and that we should just instead believe that there is a community of devas and that they are not macro God, except in the sense that the general pantheism or panentheism is true, in which case everything is God in one way or another, and then you could articulate different ways in which those beings are divine. Big punchlines, and then we can wrap things up. So my suggestion is that Christianity might need to become more like Hinduism. And the first thing I want to say about this is that this is nothing to be afraid of. This is Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was very intentionally synthesizing aspects of Christianity with aspects of Hinduism. By doing so, he was able to overthrow one of the most powerful governments in the world in a non-violent way. There's every reason to believe that a healthy synthesis of Hinduism and Christianity is going to be perfectly capable of providing a rich and life-satisfying worldview in which we can persist. In fact, just in general, a worldview that can unite Christianity and Hinduism is better than one that can't. It has always been a peculiar feature of Christianity that it has felt, imperial Christianity, that it has felt it necessary to condemn traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, and it would be better if Christianity could alter its dogmas in a way that would allow for a more substantial recognition of the goodness of other traditions. Christianity also did used to be more like Hinduism. That is, in the apostolic era, there was a wide variety of theological expressions, including ones that look a lot like the Hindu doctrines of avatars in their various states, various concepts of who Jesus was, how he related to the divine, etc., were fleshed out in ways that are allowed in Hinduism, but that are not allowed in Christianity. And the reason is because the politicians got involved. There has never been a Hindu Constantine. And for that reason, Hinduism continues to express a very broad range of theological possibilities, which Christianity has not allowed itself to do, essentially because it aligned itself with the imperial desire to homogenize belief across the empire to make it easier to rule. The punchline for me then is that after disclosure, synoptic Christianity, that is, the stories of Jesus being born of a virgin, performing miracles, walking on water, raising the dead, being crucified and raised from the dead himself, those stories all become more plausible than they did before, because then we start to see other cases in which those same kinds of powers and capacities were exhibited. The standard of evidence then goes down in order to believe that such things actually happened. But imperial Christianity will likely become less plausible. Thank you.